Hello to my online learners. Female reproductive system, here we go. First off, name the parts. What do they do? When we look at it, first off, I want you to be aware that the female part it's not really complicated, but there are, in a diagram like this, there are three things shown. Let's first look at so this is the anus and the rectum right here. And often it's put in there just to realize, first off, there's the perineum here, or these pelvic floor muscles are important. And quite often during childbirth, you'll hear about a fistula, which can be problems or ripping, which will cause a tear in the rectum. Very common in Africa. And then you have these ladies who have leakages, and it's not good. So that's the anus, or the end of the digestive system. Then you also have the urinary system. Oops, so here's the urinary system. So here's the bladder and the urethra. And then again you have your pelvic wall. Now, one thing in front is so when we're talking about reproductive system, the reproductive system is kind of in the middle. And this is one reason why you can have yeast infections and urinary infections, and everything is very close. So first off, there is the clitoris up here. And the clitoris is the organ of stimulation that will lead to excitation, and it's in front of the urethra. And then here we have the vagina. The vagina is the opening and the vaginal canal. Then we also have the uterus here, and the uterus has a muscle, isn't there, an entry into the uterus called the cervix at the bottom. And the cervix kind of looks like a belly button. And then you have the fallopian tubes, and the fallopian tubes are also called the uterine tubes and also called the oviduct. So there's three words for that. And then you have the ovary here, and the ovary is where the eggs develop. Unlike the sperm, where they have a closed channel all the way to the outside of the body, the egg that gets released does not, because these fimbriae, which are the little finger-like things here, will cover over. So there's a possibility for either the uterine lining to get outside into the body cavity, such as endometriosis, or there's also a situation where the egg will not be picked up by the fallopian tube. So there's actually a movement there, and I'll show you in a video on fertilization how the fimbriae will move over top. So we've got those three different regions pretty much. Okay, to look at the ovary, let's go back to the textbook. The ovary is the primary sex organ, or the primary reproductive organ in the female. So you have two ovaries, one on each side, and they're about the size of an almond. So they're not very big, even though they look huge in this textbook. And they will produce the eggs, which is called the ova, and also the sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Now, there are ligaments that hold it all together, but with time and with the proper stimulation of hormones, the primary follicles will develop. Now, don't worry about all this terminology. Just realize you start with a follicle, then it becomes a primary follicle. Eventually, there's this little space inside of it, and then this space will just a second, we're on the textbook, right? I can't write on it. The space will then become this, they'll have a distinct egg in the middle, and then that egg will be released on ovulation, leaving behind these cells. And these cells that are left behind become the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is very important because it's the corpus luteum that starts to secrete progesterone. Okay? Now, remember that the follicles are stimulated to grow by follicle stimulating hormone. And it's follicle stimulating hormone that will start the follicles to grow. Then as they grow, the growing follicle will release estrogen. So it's the follicle that releases estrogen. So before we just talked about the ovary. Now I want you to get specific. It's the follicle that is releasing the estrogen. The estrogen there then is one of the is what causes the secondary sex characteristics, which are widened hips, enlargement of breast material, and usually laying down of fat. Then when the luteinizing hormone is stimulated and released from the anterior pituitary, luteinizing hormone is what causes ovulation. Then at ovulation, after ovulation, you have the corpus luteum left behind. Okay, so when you look at the female system, you need to consider two organs. You need to consider what's going on in the ovaries and how the ovaries are preparing to ovulate, or for the development of the egg and then release of it, which is ovulation. And then estrogen will start to prepare the uterine lining, and progesterone will continue the uterine lining development. Okay, let's look a little bit more about the internal genitalia. When we look at the uterine lining. Okay. The uterus and the uterine lining. So first off, when you look at the uterus, there are three layers of the uterus. You have let's start with the outer side, the perimetrium, which is outer, and the perimetrium is usually for protection and security. Then you have the myometrium. The myometrium is muscles, and this is what gives the uterine contraction, which are very important in labor. Then you have the endometrium, and the endometrium is the thicker layer where what we know is the uterine lining, and this is what's sloughed off during menstruation. Okay, don't worry about the term isthmus and ampulla or infundibulum, but you do need to know fimbriae, and fimbriae are these finger-like projections that go over the egg during ovulation. Now, when you look at the vagina is the opening. It's the muscle tube about 8 centimeters long, and it's a receptacle for receiving the penis and the sperm. And it's also where menstrual fluid is discharged, and also the birth canal. There is smooth muscle walls of the vagina, and these can expand greatly during childbirth and also can be stimulated during arousal. The inferior end is the cervix, and this is sort of the end that kind of closes it off, and we'll look at that in another part later. Okay, so that's what you need to know in terms of the internal genitalia. The external genitalia, and I'm sorry, this is not the prettiest. It's kind of a stark picture, but I want you to realize that unlike males that only have 2 openings outside the body, the female has 3. And there's also the clitoris at the front, which is stimulatory, and this provides sexual stimulation. So that is part of it. Then you have the labia minor and the labia minis, and these are just the fancy words for the lips. And there is supposed to be a a little bit of fat and padding here to help with friction. Okay. Now inside the labia is the vestibule, and the vestibule is sort of the opening that contains all the other openings. Some things that we don't talk about often with females is the fact that there are lubrication glands, and you may not have heard of the vestibular glands, also called the Skene's glands, and this helps with fluid release and lubrication, and sometimes it's seen as the female ejaculation, and it's also the vestibular glands, and these will help for lubrication during sexual intercourse. So they help with lubrication and stimulation. Then this is the perineum in the middle, and then we have the anus here. So I don't know, it's not a pretty picture, but it is very informative. Good. We'll just talk briefly about the breasts, more the fact that the breast is a secondary sex organ. And don't worry about all the terms with the breast. Just realize that the breast tissue contains these glands, and each one of these glands have a different opening, and the darker part is called the areola. It circles the nipples, and then there's just fat in here and muscles. And it is the breasts that are stimulated by prolactin and oxytocin to produce milk. Okay, now when we look at the hormones are quite tricky because we're going all the way back to the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and it works in a very tricky cycle because females cycle. So,
lies equally with both men and women. The main players in the female reproductive cycle are the pituitary gland, the ovaries, and the uterus. Their activities are closely coordinated. Each month, one or other ovary releases a single egg, an event known as ovulation. It is brought about by a series of complex interactions between the pituitary gland, the ovaries, and the uterus. The pituitary gland is itself under the control of this small area of the brain known as the hypothalamus.
Equally with both men and women.
A new menstrual cycle begins.
The main players in the
cells
female
of
reproductive
the center
cycle are
secrete
the
a
pituitary
hormone
gland,
called
the ovaries, and the
gonadotropin-releasing
uterus.
hormone,
Their activities are
GnRH,
closely
into the
coordinated.
network of blood vessels
Each
which
month,
surrounds
one
the
or other
pituitary
ovary
gland,
releases a single egg, an
stimulated
event
by
known as
pulses of
ovulation.
gonadotropin-releasing
It is brought
hormone.
about by a
Cells
series
in the
of complex
pituitary gland secrete
interactions
another
between the
hormone,
pituitary gland, the
follicle-stimulating
ovaries,
hormone,
and the
or
uterus.
FSH.
The pituitary gland is itself under the control of
FSH
this small
travels in the
area of the
bloodstream,
brain
reaching
known
the
as the
ovaries.
hypothalamus.
There it
A
stimulates
new
the
menstrual
formation
cycle
and
begins
growth of an
when the
ovarian
nerve cells
follicle
of this
in one
center
or other
secrete a
ovary.
hormone called
follicle consists of an
gonadotropin-releasing
egg, a
hormone,
number of surrounding cells which
GnRH,
secrete estrogen
into the network
hormones
of blood
and
vessels
fluid.
which surrounds the
FSH
pituitary
helps the egg
gland.
to mature and prepares
Stimulated
it for
by
release.
pulses of
As the
gonadotropin-releasing hormone,
okay, let's
cells in the
summarize
pituitary
some
gland
of the
secrete
female
another hormone,
hormones just to
follicle-stimulating
summarize,
hormone,
because we've
or
talked a lot about
FSH.
here. So, female
FSH
hormones.
travels in the bloodstream, reaching the ovaries.
So first
There
off,
it stimulates
we
the
talked
formation
about
and
the
growth of an
main-
ovarian
the video also
follicle
shows the
in
main
one or
controller
other
is
ovary.
The
The follicle consists of an egg, a number of surrounding
hypothalamus
cells which secrete
releases
estrogen hormones, and fluid. FSH helps the egg to mature and prepares it for release.
Hormone. Okay.
As the follicle
And that will act on the anterior pituitary. And the acting on the anterior pituitary will start with the release of follicle stimulating hormone. Then follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, will start the development of the follicle. Now realize the follicle will eventually become the egg, but there's sort of different terms because it's not like the sperm where you just have a nucleus with a tail on it. There's a lot of cells involved.
Matures, the hypothalamus increases secretion of GnRH. This in turn stimulates the pituitary to secrete a second hormone which acts on the ovary. This is luteinizing hormone, or LH. Toward the middle of the cycle, there is a sudden peak in the blood level of LH.
Okay, let's look at this. The normal textbook female cycle is 28 days, and day 0 is the first day of menstruation. That's why most females, when get asked by your doctor when was the last day of your first day of menstruation,
GnRH.
I'm not sure
This
why,
in turn
but
stimulates
they like to know
the
it.
pituitary to secrete a
that
second
is day
hormone
0.
which acts on the ovary.
On day
This
14,
is luteinizing
that
hormone,
is
or
technically ovulation day. And ovulation day is due
Toward
to
the middle of the cycle, there is a sudden peak in the blood level of LH.
That causes ovulation.
This acts as the trigger for ovulation. Within minutes of its release, the egg is guided by suction through the fringed opening of the outer end of the fallopian tube, starting it on a journey which will take 5 or 6 days as it passes down the tube and finally reaches the cavity of the uterus.
Okay, so just to summarize, LH is released, it surges and peaks at day 14, which causes ovulation. So let's summarize that. So it is due to, so we talked about the hypothalamus releases gonadotrophin releasing hormone, which acts on the pituitary to form follicle stimulating hormone. Then it also acts on the pituitary to release luteinizing hormone. Now, luteinizing hormone will peak or spike on day 14, causing ovulation. Okay? And ovulation is the release of the egg out into, it's the release of the egg, pretty much, okay? I want to show you a really cool video that's actually it's actually ovulation and fertilization. I think this is it.
The reproductive cycle begins with ovulation, the release of a ripe egg or ovum from the ovary. Hundreds of thousands of follicles sit nestled inside the ovary. Each follicle is a sphere of cells with an immature egg at its center. The typical 28-day menstrual cycle begins on the first day of menstrual bleeding. During the first 7 days of the cycle, a few follicles start to grow. These maturing follicles secrete estrogen hormone into the bloodstream to prepare the lining of the uterus for pregnancy. Around day 7, all of the follicles stop growing and begin to degenerate, except for one. This dominant follicle continues to grow, nourishing the developing egg inside it. Around day 12, the follicle secretes a surge of estrogen into the bloodstream. When the estrogen reaches the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in the brain, the anterior or front part of the pituitary gland floods the bloodstream with luteinizing hormone. Around day 14, luteinizing hormone causes the follicle to undergo a sudden growth spurt. Right before ovulation, the egg detaches from the inside of the follicle. The bulging follicle releases chemicals, signaling one of the 2 fallopian tubes to move in closer and envelop the follicle. The follicle swells until it bursts open, ejecting the ovum and fluid from the follicle into the abdominal cavity. In response, the fimbriae, tiny finger-like projections at the end of the fallopian tube, sweep across the ovulation site and pick up the ovum. Microscopic cilia on the fimbrial surface guide the ovum to the entrance of the fallopian tube. Muscular contractions along the wall of the fallopian tube gently propel the ovum toward the uterus. The ovum lives for 12 to 24 hours, the interval where fertilization can occur. If not fertilized, the ovum will disintegrate and be shed along with the uterine lining during menstruation, marking the end of one reproductive cycle and the beginning of another.
Okay, there's quite a bit of terminology there. What I want to go back to is to look at how as follicle stimulating hormone is released from the anterior pituitary, it will cause about 7 follicles to develop, or many follicles, until about day 7. And then one of them takes over. I don't know why. Don't know how it's decided which one takes over, but then it will continue to develop. Now, as the follicle develops, it gives off estrogen. Let's add that to our notes. So, the developing follicle will secrete estrogen. This will trigger the hypothalamus and pituitary to release luteinizing hormone. Okay, good. Then,
when the estrogen reaches the hypothalamus,
with the stimulation of the lutein, under the stimulation of luteinizing hormone, I want you to realize that just part of the follicle gets released. The last part stays behind, and that's important because it becomes the corpus luteum. So if you see here, just this little dot-like part with some fluid comes out. And I want you to pay attention to how complicated the egg is relative to the sperm. And we'll look at that more when we talk about fertilization. When the egg is, or the ovum is the correct term now, it releases chemicals which attract the fimbriae of the fallopian tube, and then that will then cause the fimbriae to pick it up, and there are cilia in the oviduct which help to move the egg down the fallopian tube, and it's in the fallopian tube where fertilization ideally takes place. So the sperm has come into the vagina, made its way up, and it will take place there. So this is the main part of ovulation. Now notice when ovulation occurs, you have follicle stimulating hormone stimulating it. It will release estrogen. Estrogen then triggers the pituitary to also increase luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone spikes. Now that estrogen will also work on other things on the uterus, and we'll look at that. But I first off want to just summarize what happens and finish what's happening in the ovary. And that I have to go back.
Meanwhile, after the follicle ruptures, it is converted into this yellowish body known as the corpus luteum. Cells of the corpus luteum secrete the hormone progesterone, which brings about important changes in the lining of the uterus, preparing it for possible pregnancy.
Okay, so with the corpus luteum being released, the release of the ovum results in the remaining tissue developing into the corpus luteum. Okay? This will release progesterone, which helps thicken and maintain the uterine lining. Okay, so we also talked about the estrogen being released. The developing follicle secretes estrogen. This triggers it too, right there. Estrogen also helps to start the thickening of the uterine lining. Good. We will stop the video here and go to a second part because I want you to review what's happening in the ovary before we go into the uterus. So, review and stay tuned for part 2.